So I think today we are happy to have a work under Trust 1 and NC-CAV and the work that Ryan and Daniel have been doing for some time. So I think Daniel is at a better position to introduce and give a little bit background and pass it to Ryan. So Daniel.
Ali, thanks for handing it over. And we're excited to share with you a lot of our research on the topic of CAV revenue. It has somewhat of a focus on EVs, and Ryan Hassett is a transportation economist with us at the Institute for Transportation Research and Education. We call it ITRE to shorten that down a little bit, and we're on NC State's Centennial campus. So Ryan, I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Sure. Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Well, Daniel's introduced me, so I can go without having to do that now. So today, of course, I'm going to here to talk about the impacts that connected and autonomous vehicles have on NCDOT specific revenue specifically, and this has implications for revenues in all U.S. states in general, but it is specifically focused on the impact on NCDOT. And so the questions that we have are basically, how does NCDOT currently pay for our highways? What funding sources do we currently use to pay for the roads that we all use and enjoy? Why do connected and autonomous vehicles specifically pose a challenge for NCDOT? What is it about CAVs that mean that that will affect NCDOT's current revenue sources, or that might affect its current expenditures? What are the other challenges that NCDOT faces currently? Because it is not just likely, it is certain that NCDOT will face other challenges affecting its revenue. To either expenditures or funding revenues and funding can NCDOT make with the help of the General Assembly in order to keep itself on a fiscally sustainable track. So first, how does NCD currently pay for our highways? There are four primary sources for NCDOT's highway revenues right now. The largest by far is motor fuels tax. That is the gas that anybody who drives a car in North Carolina pays when they purchase gasoline or diesel at the pump. It is a per gallon tax of, I think it's 40.5 cents. Currently, I do have it written down later on. The second source is federal funding through agencies like FHWA. Federal funding is also primarily derived from a gasoline tax, the federal gasoline tax and the federal diesel tax, which means that 2/3 of the funding overall will come from gasoline taxes ultimately, or fuel taxes because it's also diesel. The third largest funding source is highway use taxes. Those two largest sources, again, motor fuel tax and federal funding, these are directly derived from fuel sales, and they make up about 2/3 of the funding that goes towards North Carolina's roads. The remaining two primary sources, highway use tax and DMV fees, are not directly tied to fuel sales, but they are still going to be susceptible to impacts from changing ownership and driving patterns, for example, from CAVs. So motor fuels tax is currently the largest source of revenue by far for NCDOT. It's about 2/5 of its funding for highways. In state fiscal year, MFT revenue in North Carolina totaled $1.9 billion. The rate changes every year. It changes in January every year based on data from the previous July, and it's set on a sort of complicated formula based on how much the population changed in the previous year and how much the price of energy changed in the previous year, plus 34 cents. This is slightly unusual because the change in population, you can imagine why that might have an impact on the cost that NCDOT faces and why NCDOT might want to collect more revenue when the population grows. The change in energy prices is not necessarily a good proxy for NCDOT's expenditures. In fact, if the price of gasoline goes down, the motor fuels tax in North Carolina will go down, but usage of the roads will go up because it will be cheaper to drive as gasoline will be cheaper. So at times when demand for the roads goes up, our motor fuel tax goes down. And when demand for the road goes down because gasoline is more expensive, we increase the motor fuels tax. This is slightly a strange choice. The current rate for MFT, which is charging both diesel and gasoline, is 40.5 cents per US gallon. On top of that, there is a 1/4 cent inspection tax, which goes to inspecting gasoline facilities. I forget if it's either pipelines or tanks, or it might be stations. But the point that doesn't really actually matter is it does not go to NCDOT to fund roads. It is separate from the amount that goes to NCDOT for roads. The amount that goes towards NCDOT's funding is 40.5 cents per US gallon. The second largest source is federal funding. This is all the money that we receive, for example, from FHWA or from other programs. Federal funding is primarily derived from federal gas and diesel taxes. The current rate on gasoline is 18.4 cents per US gallon. There is a different rate on diesel. I did not write it down. It is higher. I think it's around 24 cents. I'm not sure. Of the 18.4 cents, it's notable that 0.1 cent, so $0.001 or 0.1 cents, goes towards storage tank inspection, storage tank cleanup, underground storage tank cleanup. I think it's called the LUST, L-U-S-T. So that actually does not go towards transportation at all, really. It goes towards something entirely different. So only 18.3 cents is available to transportation. And then I believe, so then that 18.3 cents that's left over is split between the highway trust, the highway account and the mass transit account. And I believe that 1 cent goes to the mass transit account. A very small portion goes to the mass transit account. The vast majority of the remaining 18.3 cents goes towards highway funding. This rate has been unchanged since 1993 in nominal terms. The tax in 1993 was 18.4 cents per gallon, and the tax today is 18.4 cents per gallon. This means that due to inflation, the tax has lost over half its purchasing power since 1993. Every gallon of gasoline sold in the US raised effectively twice as much money in real value that could be used towards building new roads or maintaining our infrastructure compared to today. Had the federal tax kept up with inflation, today it would be 38.4 cents per gallon. So we're charging less than half of what we were charging in 1993 in real terms, even though the country, of course, is a larger country now and construction prices and other prices have increased. Moving on to the other two primary sources that NCDOT has for funding its highways. The first is highway use tax. Highway use tax, like I said, is like a sales tax. It's effectively a sales tax. It is a 3% tax charged on vehicle purchases or transfers, and it's charged in lieu of sales tax. So when you purchase or transfer a vehicle in North Carolina, 3% of the purchase price is paid as highway use tax. Because this rate is lower than the state sales tax, it is a de facto subsidy for vehicle purchases. And what we mean by this is that the state has made it cheaper to purchase vehicles than it is to purchase other goods in North Carolina. The standard state sales tax in North Carolina is 4%, and there are also local, county, and county transportation and other sales taxes on top of that in North Carolina. So if you live in a large metropolitan county like Mecklenburg, Guilford, Wake, or Durham, you're going to the actual sales tax you would pay on most purchases at a store if you purchase a television or a bicycle would be 7.25 or 7.5%. But if you purchase a car in those counties, you'll only pay 3% tax on the purchase. This is effectively a subsidy towards vehicle purchases. It's not really, I don't think it was ever intended to be that, but that's what it acts as effectively. It is charged on purchase of both new and used vehicles, but it can be calculated net of trade-in value. This can only occur at a dealership. It does not apply to private sales. But if you were to, say, purchase a $20,000 car from a car dealership, but sell your car in the same transaction to that dealership for $5,000, the taxable basis for that would only be $15,000. It would not be $20,000. There's not really a clear policy rationale for why this trade-in should exist only at dealerships. In every state that I know of, though, dealerships are a very powerful political lobby, so I'm sure that changing this would encounter a great deal of resistance. But it is effectively a subsidy that exists towards dealership purchases that does not exist towards private sales. The rate that North Carolina charges for highway use tax is lower than the rate other states around us charge. Every other state around us has a higher rate, at least in nominal terms, than we do. The one possibility is South Carolina. South Carolina caps their equivalent tax at 5%, but their equivalent tax is 5%, but they cap it at $500. So you will never pay more than $500 in the purchase of a new vehicle in South Carolina, which means that for very, very expensive vehicles, of course, South Carolina would be cheaper. In state fiscal year 2020, the average highway use tax was around $379 in North Carolina, meaning the average sale here in North Carolina is around $13,000. However, because the price of vehicles has risen so much during the pandemic and afterwards, and it's only starting to come down slowly for used vehicles now, the average tax may now today be higher in North Carolina than it is in South Carolina. We're not sure yet, but it is certainly true that, for example, other neighboring states like Tennessee, Virginia, Georgia, I don't know if Florida, I don't know if Florida got in there. They have higher taxes than we do. I'm not sure. Oh, I know why Florida's in there because Florida was in the source we used. But the actual states that do neighbor us, Virginia, Tennessee, and Georgia, definitely have higher rates than we do. The last remaining primary source that NCDOT has is DMV fees. Like I mentioned before, this is a bunch of different fees. This is the fee that you pay to register your car. This is the fee you pay to have your license. This is the fee that fee that you pay to title a vehicle in North Carolina. Notably, this also includes the supplemental EV registration fee. If you purchase an electric vehicle in North Carolina, either a pure electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, you will pay an additional around $140 per year. It does go up. You'll pay an additional $140 per year as a registration fee, and this is supposed to make up for the motor fuels tax revenue that you won't be paying. Because you won't be paying at the pump motor fuels tax, North Carolina charges you an extra $140 per year or so to register your electric vehicle in our state. There are other sources that NCDOT has for funding. The amount of that these sources raise and the amount that goes towards highways is negligible. The most notable among these other sources is tolling. North Carolina currently has 2 state-owned and operated toll facilities. These are the Triangle Expressway in Wake and Durham counties and the Monroe Expressway in Mecklenburg and Union counties. And then there are 2 more under construction, which is the Triangle Expressway extension and the I-485 express lanes in Mecklenburg County. There is a 5th toll facility in North Carolina, which is the I-77 express lanes between Mecklenburg and Iredell counties. This was built as a P3 by a private company, Sintra, the Spanish infrastructure firm. So NCDOT does not directly receive the revenue from that, so it's not really relevant to a discussion of NCDOT's revenues. Only these 4 facilities are actually going to be relevant. However, under the current law that establishes the North Carolina Turnpike Authority, the money that's raised from a tolled facility can only go towards that tolled facility or its bonds, or towards the construction of future additional tolled facilities. So we could not, for example, take the money raised from the Monroe Expressway or the Triangle Expressway and use it to make improvements on Interstate 85, because Interstate 85 is not the toll facility is raised from or a new toll facility that's under construction. So if we compare to other states as a whole in the United States, North Carolina is relatively among the states most reliant on gasoline and diesel taxes, and conversely, it's among the states that's least reliant on tolls and charges. We are currently building more toll facilities, but we're still in the bottom quartile of states. We're definitely no New Jersey or anything close to that. So now that we know how NCDOT raises money to pay for the roads and highways in our state, the question, of course, is why would CAVs affect that? And some of them are probably obvious, and some of them are going to be a little bit less obvious, I think. The first, of course, is I think it's one of the ones that people don't think about immediately, is that CAVs are autonomous. They have no driver in need of licensing. They drive themselves. That's the primary description of the technology in many ways. But this impacts fee revenue because NCDOT does not receive any licensing revenue from the operation of these vehicles. The second is that CAVs change the value of time calculation for passengers, which possibly will lead to more VMTs per person. If the vehicle drives itself, I'm now free to do other things while I'm on my journey. I can do work on my computer, possibly. I could read a book. I could play a game on my phone. I might be more willing to make a phone call than I would be otherwise if I were driving. This lowers the perceived cost to making a vehicle journey, and this might make people willing to commute further distances or take additional trips because the cost of taking that trip and the loss of their time is less. This, of course, impacts NCDOT's costs. If I'm willing to travel more, I'm going to be, of course, taking up more roadway capacity and putting higher maintenance and capital costs on NCDOT. CAVs may also change ownership patterns. If I don't have to drive the car and I can just call it on demand as an sort of like an autonomous taxi or an autonomous Uber or Lyft, I might be more likely to use CAVs as a for-hire vehicle. I might not purchase my own CAV, but just order a trip on demand. This will result in lower rates of ownership and probably fewer vehicles overall, because they won't be sharing vehicles explicitly, but they'll be using the same vehicle, different people using the same vehicle. This impacts fee revenue because every vehicle that's on the road in North Carolina is registered. That will lead to reduced registration fees. Every vehicle in North Carolina is titled. That will lead to reduced titling fees. And finally, virtually no CAVs are expected to rely on gasoline or diesel as a fuel. By the time that this technology becomes prominent and everywhere, we will almost certainly have almost universally moved on to alternative sources of fuel. And this, of course, impacts federal and MFT revenue. You don't take the CAV to the gas pump, so you're not going to be paying MFT or federal gasoline taxes when you fuel the vehicle. Now, CAVs do pose challenges to NCT's revenues for all the reasons I described. However, there are other challenges that NCT also faces at the same time as this. There are currently other challenges that NCT faces, such as changing pattern of car usage, electrification, improving fuel economy in the conventionally powered vehicles that we already have. It's almost certain that these challenges are so great that they will necessitate addressing NCDOT's funding sources before CAV technology becomes widespread. CAVs pose a medium-term threat to NCDOT's fiscal sustainability. However, some of these other challenges pose a much graver threat in the short term. So it's likely that by the time CAVs become a real hit to NCDOT's revenues, some of these shortfalls will already have been addressed. So changing kind of the car usage is an important one. So currently, value of time that I described earlier. However, in the meantime, VMTs are currently leveling off in North Carolina. Like you're not seeing the expected increase in vehicle miles traveled, but vehicle miles traveled is kind of flat, actually. This means that if people are driving less, they are consuming less they're consuming less gasoline, and therefore NCDOT is collecting less in motor fuels tax, and the federal government receives less in federal gasoline and diesel taxes. Conversely, however, if people are driving less, that also lowers NCDOT's costs. They don't have to build as much or maintain as much of what they do build. Sorry, they don't have to build as much and then maintain those new things that they would build. Increasingly, young people are delaying the age at which they are licensed or not getting licensed at all. So NCDOT does not collect licensing revenue from a driver who does not exist. Who is not licensed, and of course they don't collect any revenue from any of their other revenue for somebody who's not driving either. If you're not licensed, you're not only not paying licensing fees, but you're also not paying to register a car probably or to title a car. You're not paying for motor fuel tax because you're not driving. These affect MFT, federal funding, and fee revenue. The second major challenge is electrification. In North Carolina, it is the official policy of the state that has set through Executive Order 80 that we want to have 80,000 EVs on the North Carolina's roads by 2025. We are almost certain to meet this goal, it looks like currently, based on the numbers I've seen lately. That we've had falling costs improving technology, and if we look, this is the official adoption forecast that NCDOT prepared as part of its ZEV plan. I've looked at the data through mid-2022, and it's actually very, very close to the green line, which is the base case scenario. So this is the forecast, but through the actual numbers through 2023 look very, very similar to the actual base case scenario that was forecast. This means, of course, that by the end of the decade, there's going to be 250,000 electric vehicles on North Carolina's roads. And if costs continue to fall, or if the subsidies and other things that we see in the Inflation Reduction Act cause costs to fall further, or cause the effective cost to consumers when they make a purchase to fall further, these numbers could end up looking more like the yellow line than like the green line. Oh, it's going the wrong way. So one thing that we need to think about today is also that most EVs today are sedans or compact cars and bring in more revenue than the vehicles they replaced. So the typical electric vehicle in North Carolina is think about a Nissan Leaf, which is a small compact hatchback car, or a Tesla Model S or Model 3 sedan. So this means that these vehicles are vehicle would pay in registration fees is much more than it would have paid a similar gasoline powered car would have paid in gasoline tax. If we compare the electric vehicles on our road today with similar vehicles, a similar vehicle fleet mix to except powered by gasoline, we currently collect more in EV fee registration than we would have expected the same cars if they were powered by gasoline to provide for the state. This will change though shortly as more EV SUVs and pickups are purchased. I believe you cannot register onto the waiting list to buy a Ford F-150 Lightning, the electric powered Ford F-150 pickup truck. It is oversubscribed. But when that vehicle arrives in purchasers' hands, it is definitely true that for that vehicle, we will be collecting less money from the EV registration fee than a regular Ford F-150 would have paid in gasoline or taxes. So as people, this is of course true for the new Hummer EV also, and for the Rivian pickup truck that's available also. These vehicles pay less in EV registration than a similar vehicle powered by gasoline would have paid. The final threat is improving fuel economy. For the foreseeable future, EVs, changes in car usage are very important. But in the short term, the biggest challenge to NCDOT is actually the improving fuel economy of our conventional vehicles. Cars are a lot more efficient, and this is sort of obscured by the measure that we use because we use miles per gallon in the US. But if you replace a car that gets 10 miles per gallon with one making 15 miles per gallon, this will actually lead to a bigger reduction in fuel consumption in gross terms, and therefore a bigger reduction in motor fuels tax than replacing a car going 25 miles per gallon with one making 50 miles per gallon. So in other words, if you were to replace an older large pickup truck with a new light large pickup truck, that will have a bigger reduction in gasoline consumption than replacing an old Toyota Camry with a brand new Toyota Prius. So these small changes at the low end of the MPG scale lead to big hits to North Carolina's MMT revenue. And I did provide an example of this. So for example, a car that goes from 15 to 20 miles per gallon, if it's traveling at 15,000 miles per year, that leads to a reduction in MFT about $101. Going from 25 to 40 miles per gallon would lead to a reduction of $91. You can sort of see this more clearly if you think about how many gallons it would take to go 100 miles in a car. A truck that gets 10 miles per gallon would take 10 gallons to go 100 miles. If you replace it with one that gets 15 miles per gallon, 100 divided by 15 is 6.67 gallons. So you've reduced it by 3.33 gallons. If you had a car that made 25 miles per gallon and it wanted to go 100 miles, you would need 4 gallons of gasoline to do that. If you replace that 25 mile per gallon car with a 50 mile per gallon car and you want to go 100 miles, 100 divided by 50 is 2. So now you only need 2 gallons to do that. That's a reduction of 2 gallons. So that's actually a much smaller change than going from 10 to 15. So now we've discussed what the problems from both CAVs. So we've discussed what NCDOT's funding sources are. We've discussed the challenge that NCDOT faces from CAVs. We discussed the other challenges that NCDOT faces at the same time, some of which are similar and some of which are very different. And then what are the possible solutions to address this? The first solution, most commonly proposed, especially in academic circles, is a road user charge, which is also called frequently a vehicle miles traveled tax, a VMT fee, or a mileage-based user fee. This has a lot of advantages. VMT, especially once adjusted for weight, is a very fiscally efficient proxy for the costs incurred by NCDOT. how many miles you travel and how heavy your vehicle combined gives a very good idea of what share of the cost NCDOT faces can be attributed to your vehicle. Second, if you have if CAVs end up being owned largely by fleets, which is quite likely if they're used primarily for hire vehicles and not personally owned, fleets are likely already going to be collecting data of where their vehicles went and how far they traveled and when, and whether or not they were in North Carolina or not. And so this vehicle will be available and be maintained by a professional source, which means that it could be so it wouldn't pose an additional collection burden on the business to collect the data, because they'd already be collecting this data, and they'd be able to remit it to NCDOR or NCDOT for taxation purposes. There are disadvantages, though. It would be very difficult to impose a road user charge or vehicle mile travel tax on non-CAVs or on CAVs owned by individuals, primarily for political, not operational reasons. If you were to do a location-based VMT, so for example, if you had a GPS transponder in the car that allowed us to check where the car was and how far it traveled, there would be significant privacy complaints. It would not be socially acceptable, probably, at least in the near term, to have that method of taxation. If you were to use an odometer-based method, people who drive outside of North Carolina a great deal would complain about this. They would say it's not fair that they're being taxed by their odometer every year when they don't even drive mostly North Carolina or whatever the case might be. Rural users are also likely to object, despite them being less likely to benefit on net. Rural users are going to complain that they live further away from services or from where they work or from where they go shopping. And then they're going to say that any tax that's per mile will hurt them more. This is not likely to actually be true. Rural users make fewer trips overall. And rural users tend to own older, less efficient, larger vehicles. You see a lot more 30-year-old pickup trucks in rural parts of North Carolina than you do in urban parts of North Carolina, and a lot fewer subcompact sedans that are brand new. So the way it works, the way that it shakes out is that even though it is true that things are further away from them, rural users tend to combine their trips. So they will go to the shop on the way home from work. They will go to the doctor after taking their kids to school. They won't make separate trips the way that many suburban and exurban residents will. And when you combine this with the fact that their vehicles are less efficient, they would actually pay less in a VMT than they would under a gasoline tax. Finally, there is very little public familiarity with the road user charge. People don't know what it is. Like, I don't know what that is. I've never heard of that. My colleagues at IDRIA found in survey research and focus group research that when they survey people about it, a road user charge is one of the least preferred methods for filling NCDOT's possible revenue gap. However, when they talk to people in a focus group about it, a road user charge is one of or the most popular ways to raise revenue, which says to me at least that people don't know what a road user charge is, and they don't like it because they don't know what it is, and it's unfamiliar. But once they become more familiar with what it is and what the equity implications of a road user charge is, they're more comfortable with the idea. One final thing I would mention about a road user charge is that it could be possible to do this only for large commercial vehicles, and then maybe phase it in for small commercial vehicles and private vehicles later on. As part of IFTA, many states already make large semi-trucks collect their mileage in the state and then charge them a fee based on that mileage and not actually on the fuel sales in the state or the fuel consumption in the state. You could start with large vehicles like that. As of 2017, there was exactly one semi-tractor trailer with an EV powertrain registered in North Carolina. And researchers at the NC Clean Energy Technology Center, Heather Brutz and her colleagues, they estimated that one truck, that one electric vehicle that was paying an extra $100, it was about $130, not $140 then, in registration fee, was costing the state $3,300 in lost motor fuels tax. The electrification of semi trucks when it happens, will be a big deal. So if we end up with a lot of autonomous tractor trailers going up and down our highways, not paying any gas tax, or diesel tax, motor fuels tax, that will be a big hit to NCDOT's revenues. And this would be one of the easiest constituencies to impose a road user charge on, actually. The next is motor fuels tax reform. We charge the motor fuels tax. I described how it's calculated earlier. We could change the calculation to make it more closely match NCDOT's expenditures. So for example, like if we know that NCDOT is going to be spending X many dollars in the next 5 years, we could set the tax rate such that it would raise that much revenue. Alternatively, instead of basing it on the change in energy costs, we could index it to the change in construction costs and possibly change the formula so it's more weighted towards that and less towards population growth. There could, or it could be a multiple of the change in construction costs. At the same time, we could there are some significant advantages to this. MFT administration is simple and highly efficient. The infrastructure to collect MFT already exists. It's collected from businesses, which are less likely to evade than individuals. We already have this infrastructure. There's no change in the infrastructure. We'd just be changing the amount that we collected from the businesses. It's very difficult to evade. It's very hard to open a gas station in North Carolina and not charge MFT. If you open a gas station in North Carolina and you don't charge taxes, I promise you, you will get caught. MFT furthers the state's environmental goals. Fuel consumption is a proxy for emission externalities. So charging you for consuming your fuel helps you, encourages you to pollute less, and encourages you to consume less fuel, and it encourages you to purchase an electric vehicle. These all align with the state's environmental goals. The disadvantages is that as CAVs and other EVs make up more and more of the cars on the road, we'll have fewer and fewer cars paying taxes. If we might end up if we rely solely or primarily on MFT into the future, we will have to keep raising the rate more and more as fewer and fewer cars consume gasoline and diesel. You might end up in a situation where 20% of the cars on the road are paying for most of the roadway, while the EVs and CAVs are not paying the motor fuels tax. The thing is, I mentioned that evasion of MFT is hard, but avoidance is possible. If you live, for example, in Charlotte, you can drive right over the border of South Carolina. So if there's a limit to how much North Carolina can raise the tax before people start traveling en masse to our neighboring states to buy gasoline. It's harder in Greensboro, it's harder in Raleigh, but in places like Elizabeth City, in places like Wilmington or Fayetteville is a little bit further, but Charlotte or Elizabeth City, it's very, very easy to travel to South Carolina or Virginia respectively and purchase gasoline there if we raise our tax by a lot. And the last thing is that fuel consumption is a worse proxy for how much things cost for NCDOT, because you might have a very, very fuel efficient car that doesn't consume a lot of fuel, but you might be driving a lot. But it is a better proxy than the highway use tax. The next one is the hypothecated sales tax. This just means a sales tax diversion. This means that we're going to take a set amount of sales tax every year and put it towards roads. This is actually what we've started doing as of last year. We've already started transferring $193 million from sales tax to the state highway fund as of last year. By 2025, that amount is supposed to be $600 million, and that's per year, not the total through 2025. By 2025, we should be diverting $600 million every year from state sales tax to highways. The advantage is that like small nominal changes in sales tax result in big increases in revenue. People have a perception that a 1% change in sales tax is a small change in sales tax, but actually a 1% change in sales tax is a huge amount of money. They don't realize it for their pocketbooks. It's huge for both their pocketbooks and for the organization that's raising the tax. The administration infrastructure already exists. We already charge sales tax in North Carolina. We would not have to set anything else new. It's like changing the MFT. We would just change the amount that we collect. And it is popular among poll respondents. I think the reason it's popular among poll respondents is in part that small changes in nominal terms are actually a large amount of money. So people don't realize just how big a 1% change in sales tax might be, but it is popular among poll respondents. It is the most popular choice that we offered when polling for how the state should fill its revenue gap. The disadvantage is that it violates what we call the user pays principle, which means that we're not charging people based on their usage of the roads anymore. You're paying for the roads whether you use them or not, and you're paying for the roads no matter how much you use the roads. You can use the roads all day, every day, or you could use the roads not at all. You could never leave your house, and you'd still be paying the same amount if you purchase the same amount of stuff from a store. And the second is that North Carolina sales tax is a regressive tax by nature. Poorer households have less disposable income. A higher percentage of the income of the money that poorer households have goes towards purchases versus while higher income households will have less consumption and more investments in their household expenditure mix. This can be fixed though through other policy changes, such as a rebate every year. So some states, and for example, countries such as Canada, they do a rebate every year for their poorest households of sales tax. So every year when they file your tax return, or possibly every quarter, you receive a direct deposit or a check that's supposed to make up some amount of the sales tax that you paid, and that changes it from a regressive tax to a progressive tax. The next is highway use tax reform. The highway use tax could be raised to more closely match the cost of conventional state and local sales taxes and to close the trading exemption. The advantages, again, are similar to the other ones where this tax already exists, the infrastructure already exists, we're just changing what the tax is. And this would level the playing field compared to like purchases of non-vehicles or purchases made outside of a dealership. As I said, motor vehicle dealers are a very influential organization, a very influential constituency overall everywhere in the US at the state government level. If this were done, you can expect a great deal of opposition from motor vehicle dealers. The second is that the price of a vehicle is not closely related to NCDOT's costs. If I buy a used Chevy Suburban from 10 years ago and I drive it 50,000 miles this year, that's going to impose a great deal of cost due to the weight and travel that I do on NCDOT. While if I buy a brand new Ferrari and I keep it in my garage all day, that's not going to impose a lot of cost on NCDOT, but that Ferrari will pay a lot more in tax than that Suburban would. And finally, if CAVs reduce ownership, then the HUT base might decrease. So, if there's fewer vehicles overall, we might collect less in highway use tax if we don't change the rate. This might be offset though if CAVs are much more expensive than our current vehicles. So if we don't change the rate and there's fewer vehicles, but each vehicle is much, much more, that might not actually lower HUT revenue if we change the CAVs. The next is increased fee revenue. NCDOT could shift towards a greater share of revenue from all drivers and vehicles being fee derived, or it could continue to increase the flat amount that we charge per electric vehicle now. So instead of charging $140, we could increase it to $200, $300, $500, and so on into the future, filling up the gap from MFT. Administration is very efficient for fee revenue. Because we already have the infrastructure in place, you already pay your registration fee every year. A disadvantage though is that, an advantage is that evasion is difficult. I'm less confident about this than when I first wrote it because I'm seeing a lot more cars on the road that don't seem to have real license plates. But in theory, at least, it's very hard to drive a car without a title or registration in North Carolina. You need to have a license plate with the current tag, hopefully. The disadvantage is that CAVs may result in fewer licenses, which means that there are not going to be enough people getting driver's licenses, and then there are not as many people paying the fee to have a driver's license. CAV The EV fee that we currently charge runs counter to the state's policy objectives. Charging a flat fee per vehicles that's effectively more than what they pay in motor fuels tax is a discouragement to purchasing an EV, and the state's goal is for you to purchase an EV. And a flat fee is a very poor proxy for NCDOT's costs for the reasons I already discussed. It doesn't reflect how much you drive, and it also poses no discouragement to you driving more. If they were to raise the current $140 rate to say increase it by 50 or 100%, so from 140 to 210 or 140 to 280, either increase, that would result at the end of the decade in NCDOT collecting $70 million per year from the EV registration fee. And if they doubled it, $70 million is not a small amount of money by any means. But again, the amount of motor fuels tax that there are other possible solutions. We can introduce a for-hire vehicle tax or fee. Currently, in North Carolina, it is not legal for a state or local government to charge a fee or tax on for-hire vehicles and no for-hire vehicle trips, and no such fee or tax exists right now. The only exception is that airports in North Carolina are allowed to charge a fee on for-hire vehicle trips. We can introduce a tax in North Carolina saying that X percentage of all for-hire vehicle trips must be remitted to the state. We could charge a flat fee of $1 or $2 per trip. we could charge a fee for how many miles your trip in a for-hire vehicle was. And these would all have the advantages or disadvantages of the different flat rate or per mile fees that I discussed earlier. There is a proposal from the NC Chamber called the access user fee, which would be a set fee that everybody would pay. They would get rid of the motor fuel tax, and everybody would pay a set fee per month to access North Carolina's roads. This has all the different advantages of the other flat fees that I discussed, where there's no discouragement to driving less, but there's no encouragement to drive less. There's no disincentive for driving more. There's no penalty for driving a less efficient vehicle. We can increase tolling more. That's on the one hand, that's good because tolls can be a good proxy for the cost of maintaining that road, but we can't toll every road. We're not going to be able to put tolling infrastructure in on every road, and we definitely cannot put tolling infrastructure in on any federal aid highways unless they are new construction, capacity improvements for an existing road, or part of an FHWA pilot program. In general, we can't put tolls on existing interstate and U.S. highways on the lanes that already exist. We could fund NCDOT from state appropriations, which is how a normal department in North Carolina is funded. I work, and many of you work for a public university in North Carolina. The UNC system gets an amount of money every year from the state. There is no special tax that exists to fund the UNC system. Similarly, DHHS doesn't have a special Medicaid tax that just pays to run the Medicaid program. Every year, every 2 years as part of the budget cycle, the General Assembly appropriates money to these departments to run their services. And NCDOT could be run more like a normal state department. There is also the possibility of transfer of facilities from the state to cities or towns or even counties. Currently, no county in North Carolina has a highways department. Counties do not run roads in North Carolina. They're either run by the state, cities, or towns or villages. And this can often include very mundane streets. There are very quiet residential streets in North Carolina that are maintained by NCDOT that in any other state would be maintained by the local municipality or the local county. The state could say, this shouldn't be our responsibility. The local county or town has to take this over. That would solve NCDOT's funding problem, but it wouldn't solve the funding problem. The county or town would then have to find the money to pay for that road. That just gets the responsibility off NCDOT's back. This is also true for funding the state for NCDOT from state appropriations. If we say that we're going to fund it out of funding the money every year from the General Assembly, that's great. But then the General Assembly still has to find that money somewhere. We could divert income tax. This would work with the sales tax, where we take a set amount of the sales tax every year, and we would do this for income tax to take a set amount of the income tax every year. This is very difficult because we are currently drawing down the income tax rate. So our income tax rate is going down every year, and the long-term goal is to have no income tax at all, according to our political leadership in the state and the General Assembly. So it's going to be impossible to divert a tax source that's getting smaller every year and might not exist in the future. And the last is taxes or fees on non-motorists. I have heard the suggestion that we should charge a fee to have a bicycle in North Carolina, for example. So we've gone over what the problem that we've gone over what NCDOT receives its funding from, what the problems that CAVs pose to those funding, the problems that NCDOT we've gone over where NCDOT receives its funding, what problems CAVs pose to that funding, what other problems that funding exists, and what possible solutions may be. And so now I'm curious if you guys have any questions about this.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting talking, especially it wasn't similar the way that we have some other talks in our seminar series. This is more or less toward the technology side of it. So this was quite interesting. So to be honest, I didn't get bored at any part. So I was following piece by piece of all information. So it was really interesting. So a lot of it, part of this conversation was kind of interesting and new to me as well. Okay. So any question?
Yes, I have a question. This is Kareem Hogan. So given the fact that the fuel revenue is being pretty much diverted to entities like Duke Energy, the folks that are supplying electricity to power the EVs at home and on the roads, is there any is it feasible to, I guess, approach them as far as, extra taxes, or maybe the manufacturers that are making a vehicle to kind of recoup some of the loss from the fuel revenue?
Yes, that is a proposal that exists in the states. Pennsylvania and Indiana are trying to do this, where they want to tax the electricity that is used for electric vehicles specifically. So if you use electricity towards an electric vehicle, they want to divert that tax money. They want to put a tax on that electricity only, and say that electricity will pay a special tax to pay for the roads. There are some challenges with this. I believe that Indiana is only doing this for electric vehicle charging that happens outside the road. Outside the home. And the reason for this is that it's very, very hard to figure out what electricity in somebody's house went towards their car versus what electricity went towards everything else in the house. If we started putting in a thing where you have a separate meter to have like a high capacity charger in your house, we would see a lot of people like trickle charging their cars 120 volt outlets in the kitchen or something. People would evade that. People would find a way to get the electricity from their regular electricity into their car. The other thing is that the rates that Indiana and Pennsylvania are proposing for this are very, very different rates. I believe the one in Indiana is just a bill, and Pennsylvania might also be. I'm not sure. One of them might be a law, but one of them is definitely a bill, and it might be that both of them are just bills and haven't passed yet. But the proposed rates are very different. I believe that the Indiana's rate is twice as much as the Pennsylvania rate. It seems that state legislatures don't know what to set the rate at. I'm sure that we could calculate that and figure it out. But the primary concern really is evasion. People would not tolerate a tax on all the electricity going to their house. And if we say that's okay, we're just going to tax the electricity going to your car, people will find a way to charge their cars without paying that tax inside the privacy of their own homes. They will trickle charge their car. They will get their buddy who's an electrician to illegally install a car charger. They will find a way to evade that tax. So the only way you could do that is by taxing all electricity higher. And I'm not sure if that's politically feasible. And also some people have solar panels too. So, people with solar panels will still not be paying that tax.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. That's actually a really good question. I forgot to mention that one, I think.
Any other question? Let me ask a question. So you mentioned about Indiana and some other states that they have already adjusted and so on. So are we, what is the kind of status in North Carolina as far as adopting any sort of regulations, and when are we expecting to see more major changes based on the ongoing conversation? Are you aware of that sort of conversation when we're going to see some kind of clear kind of insight what direction we're going to go?
So, I mean, we've already started making some changes. While we were doing this project, one change came into effect, which was the diversion of state sales tax that I mentioned that started in the last year. That was passed at the last minute, right before the budget passed. So, this passed in like June 2022, effective July 2022. So the state started saying, oh, we're going to take money from the state sales tax and give it to NCDOT. This solves the problem NCDOT is funding for a few years. But eventually the problem's going to come back in the next decade or so. So that's one way they've started. The other way is that they have been increasing the electric vehicle registration fee. It used to be $130. It used to be less than that. Some states charge much, much more than we do. There are states that are charging over $250 per year to register an electric vehicle. I guarantee you that the typical electrical vehicle in that state, if it were a gas vehicle, would not have paid $250 in gasoline taxes. So they are charging much, much more for electric vehicles than they are charging for gasoline and diesel vehicles in those states. I think it is likely, given the direction the state is going, especially in the General Assembly, that we will continue to see continued increases in the electric vehicle registration fee beyond $140. I think that fee will go up. But again, we don't have a ton of, that won't raise a ton of revenue over the next decade. If they doubled the fee, it would raise, I don't know, I think $70 or $80 million, I said. That's a lot of money, but it's a small amount of money compared to motor fuels tax.
And it looks like that all of these adoption is all of these changes are toward the kind of adoption of EVs rather than CAVs, right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. Yep.
Right.
Nobody's even thinking about CAVs, to be honest. I don't think anybody's thinking about CAVs. I have to admit, the thing that really concerns me a lot is the idea of like autonomous semi-trucks, because semi-trucks contain a ton of fuel, and autonomous drivers don't need to sleep.
Right.
So, and truckers do need to sleep. We're pretty strict about that one. So I think I think that should be on people's radars, because I think that's like one of the first places we'll see. One of the first places we're likely to see CAV applications is semi-trucks on limited access highways, and it just so happens that semi-trucks consume a ton of gasoline. So that will be a big revenue hit if that becomes quite common. I guess they consume diesel, not gasoline, but you know what I mean.
Right.
They consume a ton of fuel, and the fuel is taxed.
Right. Okay. So, any other question? Last call for questions.
If anybody does have questions later, my email is there. It's my first name, underscore my last name at ncsu.edu. So you can always email me more questions later. I'm sure I might have the answer.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much. Dr. Omifar, do you have any announcement before we are joining the meeting?
Okay, yeah, just a second. Next week, we have Wes, the Vice President for Verizon, who's going to be talking about the impact of 5G and 6G, specifically on urban air mobility. So I hope there are going to be a lot of folks joining us from Purdue and Georgia Tech and our industry partner.
Great. Thank you so
Great
much,
job.
everybody.
Thank you so much. Yes.
And have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you for having me. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you.
Okay.
It was a great
Bye-bye.
talk.
Bye-bye.